Hi everyone! In this video we're going to learn about promises in JavaScript. So today we're going to learn about what kind of problem we're going to solve with promises. We're going to learn how we're going to use the promises and as well how we're going to create our own promises in JavaScript. And lastly we're going to learn some advanced promise techniques in JavaScript, and yeah, this is again a very hands-on video, so we should better get coding. I have already a folder with two files. I have index.html, which is an empty HTML file with a script tag for a script called xhr.js. Here we have a very simple fetch JSON function, and I want to have maybe 2-3 minutes to walk you through the function, what it does, and how to use it. So the fetch JSON function, it takes two parameters as an input. The first one is the URL, and the second one is callback. The function itself, it gets a URL and returns the JSON from the remote server. And the way it does it, it uses the callback. And callback is, if this is the first time you see this kind of syntax, you're going to see this a lot. This is a callback function and this is of type function, then this should be a function. Maybe it will be easier if I show you just how to use it, instead of we will deep dive into the code itself. So how we're going to use this usage, we want to just call the function with the URL here. And in this exercise, we're going to use the random user API. And this is a really simple API that when you call it, you're just going to get a large JSON of a random person, a random name, random address, random email. And every time you refresh the page, you're going to get a new random person. So I'm going to use this one to fetch the JSON. Because the second parameter is a callback and it should be a function, we're going to also use a function. I will use an error function here. And this callback should have two parameters inside. One is error and the second one is data. And the way it works, that as soon as fetch JSON calls to the server, calls to the server and gets a data, it will call my callback, and it will also call my callback function if there was an error. So we can handle this in the same place. If error, then I can maybe use console log error, and else console log, I can maybe log the data itself. So this is how you use this function. So the first parameter is the URL here, and the second one is the function here. And this function is actually the result of the request. Let's deep dive into how it works. And we'll be going to use the callback here. And this function simply creates an XML HTTP request with type of JSON. And it uses the regular syntax and the regular standards, how to use XML HTTP request. We're handling the onload here. We're handling on error here. And in the end, here we open and send the request. What is it interesting in this function, that on the onload, if for example we had we had a successful HTTP status, we want to return the result back to the person who called this function, and we're using callback. So as you can see, because there was no error, the first parameter is null and the second parameter is the data. This is very similar to what I also handle here, and this is quite common standard in JavaScript. The first parameter is an error and the second one is the data. On error, on the other hand, we do call the callback function, but we now use the first parameter and define an error, and the second parameter is null because there was an error, so there is no data. Similarly, we're also doing this when there's an HTTP status code, only the error is different. However, still no data, as you can see here. And this is basically how it works. And this is how we use it. Let's check out that everything works fine. I'm going to open the file, refresh, and yes, we do get the data from the server itself. So this is time for our first exercise. We're going to have a few, I think 4 exercises in this video. And this is the exercise that we are going to do. Exercise number 1. So first of all, I want you to create HTML and JavaScript files just like I did. Then I want you to create the same fetch.json function and add this to your code. And lastly, which is the exercise itself, I want you to, using fetch.json, I want you to call the random user API twice, but not just twice just like that. I want you to call twice, one after another, which means that after you will call the second time get user API only after the first request was successful. So we're calling one request, waiting for response, then we're calling for the second one, and then we're waiting for response, and then we're done. And I want you also to console log the email of the random person twice, of course. One time for each person, so you're going to get 2 different emails. And the most important part is the last one. Make sure that second request is only, to do the second request only after the first one succeeded. So you can now pause the video. I'll show you again the whole fetch.json function. So if you need, you can pause here and copy to your code and again understand how it works. And then you can do the exercise. Let me put this below here. Just like that. Yeah. Right. All right. So I'll be back in a few seconds with the solution. All right, we're back. So here's the solution to the first exercise. The first 2 parts I've already done because I already have the index.html and the XHR files here. So let's do the second part. In the second part, I'm already calling fetch.json once, and I'm already printing the data. So let's start with first printing the email instead of the data. Luckily, I've already done console log of the data, so I can easily go back to the console and see how can we get the email. I'm propagating inside the JSON to see that we have a results. And inside of results, it's an array with 1 item. So the first item contains the whole the information about this person. And I need the email, so this is here. In Chrome, there's a really handy tip that if you put your mouse on the email, it can show you in the tooltip what's the exact path to get it. So it says results0.email. Let's use it. I'm going to back the code. So data.results in position 0.email. Let's double check. And there we go. We're printing an email. And every time I refresh the page, I see a different email. Great. So now let's do the second request. And the most important thing is that we need to do the second request only after the first one succeeded. And the place where we exactly know when the first request was succeeded is here. It's exactly where we're printing it. So we need to do this inside of this callback. And not just inside of this callback, but also inside of this else. Because if there was an error, we don't want to call another request. So how are we going to do this? Well, we have only one function, so let's call fetch.json with the URL. Since it's the same URL, I will be a good citizen and I'll extract it into a constant. And I'll give it a meaningful name. Just like that. Now I can use this here. And now I need fetch.json. And fetch.json, as we know, we need to have another callback here. And one one mistake that many people are making is that I cannot use error once again because this error is already defined in this scope. You see, there's an error here and there's a data here. So I maybe need to do something like error2 and data2. And this is again a callback function. So I need to have a function here. And we're going to do something like that. And inside, well, first of all, we need this line because we do need to print. So let's maybe add some comments. Print the first person's email. So this is this. Request second person. And now we're here. And once again, we need to check if there's error. And if there's error, now error number 2, we need to do something else. And finally, in this else, we know that the second request succeeded and we got the second person's email. And we're going to use data2 to get the second person's email. And this is how you do this. Now let's try to see if it works. Let's refresh the page. And as you can see, 1, 2, you saw 2 requests, one after another. 1 and 2. The network tab, you can also see, you can see the timeline. It's quite handy to see the waterfall here. So this is the first request, it is done, and then you can see the second request. And this is the solution to this exercise. Now I want to show you how can we do a third request. So what happens if you want to get 3 emails instead of 2? Well, this is easy. We already have the fetchJSON function. Let's do this. So where do we call this? We call this after we're printing the second email. So this is the second email. So here, both were success. So we need to call request third person. So let's do this. Let's call fetchJSON. And I'm already copying it. And we need now data3 and error2 because we cannot use error, and we also cannot use error2. Those are both defined in the same scope. So we can do something like this. And now, once again, we need to handle an error. So if error3, there was error, else. Here we can print the data3. Finally, we can print the user, the third email. Let's check again that it works. Yes, it works. We can see 3, one after another. And look what happened here. Look at the code. We created some really ugly code. And this code is very, very nested. You can see the else, and inside the else you can see a fetchJSON and another fetchJSON and another fetchJSON. And this is something that we call callback hell. You can Google this. You see that every time it's more and more and more and more indent. So, and then after that I can see a bunch of those braces and parentheses, and it's really, really hard to read this code. And this is why callbacks are good for simple ways, for simple things, but to do some complex things, they are very inconvenient to work with. And we're going to rewrite this with promises. I'm going to delete this code, or maybe even make it callback hell. And I'm going to maybe comment this out. I don't want to see this again. So now that we found out what's the problem with callbacks, we're going to finally learn about promises. I'm going to import Axios. And the reason for this is because Axios uses promises. And you already used Axios a little bit, so I think you already know your way around it. Once again, to bring Axios, I can just import a script file here. I'm adding the script file here, and I want to create a new file. I'll call it script.js. And in Visual Studio Code, by the way, there's a really handy thing that if you're command click on a Mac, or I think it's control click or alt click on Windows, it will just offer you to create this file because it's unable to open. So you just click on create file, and there we go. Very easy, very handy. So what is promise? If we go and use Axios, if you remember to use Axios here, you're just calling axios.get, and here maybe I want to use the same URL like the random person API. So we're doing axios.get with the URL here, and we're doing something like then and catch, and finally. This looks something like this. But what axios.get does, it actually returns us a promise. So we can do something like this. Promise, my promise. And this promise is an actual object that you can work with. For example, we can log it. Let's see what happens here. My promise. So the axios.get, it does an HTTP request, but it also returns us a promise. Let's see how it looks in the console log. Going back here, I'm going to clean it, and we printed something called promise pending. And it means that we're still waiting for the asynchronous task to finish. Promises, they have 3 states. And this is how it works. Promises, they have 3 states. The 3 states are pending. Pending state means the asynchronous task is not finished yet. They're still fetching data from the server because it takes a while. Second state is resolved, which means the task has successfully finished. And the third state that the promise can be is rejected, which means that there are some errors have occurred during the task. And the actual thing that you cannot go back to any state. So the promise is pending. After that, it can either go to resolved with the data, or it could go to rejected state with an error. And that's it. And after that, the promise is in this state forever. So this is the basic how promise works. It's actually a very simple object, but it's very, very powerful. And to use this promise, if you recall correctly, to use this promise, to get you can use then, and you can use catch. My promise.catch. You can use it like this. And the then handler promise is the callback when the promise is resolved. And similarly, the catch callback, it is a callback when the promise is rejected. So naturally, catch will send us an error, and then will send us the data or the result of this task. It might be null. It might not send all the time result, which is fine, but it's always good to know if there's a result or not. And the last one is finally. This calls this function for both error and success. So this always happens. Those are the 3 parts of promises, and notice that I did something very different from the usage. I just call them like this. This is a very easy, I think, way to understand those promises, because you can see that you can work on with this object just like that. I think I will console log and I'll show you that this works with Axios before we'll continue. Resolved. And I'll also log the result itself. And let's log an error. Console log, error. We can append the error here. And let's also log something final in the finally log done. Let's just test it to see if it works. There we go. So we got the result, we got the data, and we got the done as well. And we didn't get the catch callback because there was no error. We can simulate an error by maybe adding here a little bit extra letters. Let's check this out. There we go. A lot of red error messages, but the most important thing that we see our message error, and then this is the whole error itself. And done still happens. This is the basics of the promises. This is how it works. So why do we need this? We still have those functions here. We still have those kind of callbacks. Yeah, it's just split it into 3 parts. And that's, if you're asking yourself, this is actually a really good question. So the real power of promises is something called promise chaining. And promise chaining means that I can combine a few promises together in a long string, like a chain. Maybe see if I can find any example online. Promise chaining. Let's see if I find a nice image here. Something like this, maybe. Yeah. So as you can see, the first promise resolves and calls to the second promise, which resolves and calls to the third promise. But I'd rather show you instead of just explaining about this. Let me show how you can do promise chaining. And I'm going to delete those 2 at least. And here was what I'm going to do here. I'm going to call this API twice, just like callbacks, but only I'm going to use promises instead. So as you can see, I have my first promise here, the Axios get. And when the API is successful, I want to log the result. Maybe I want to log the data, results 0 email. I think I got it right. And then I want to call another request. And the way I can do this is to just do return axios.get random user API. And since we're returning a promise here, this is a promise. If you recall correctly, axios.get returns a promise, and the then itself returns a promise. We can call another then with result, which will give us the results of this promise. So this is the chaining. This is the fetch got user 1, and in this promise we got user 2, persona maybe. And here we can also console log the email of the user. Let's test this to see that it works. And as you can see, I'm making 2 requests, one after another with promises. Here in the HTTP, this is one, and as soon as the first completed, the second one is being executed. And this is very powerful because then you can combine and do a global catch for both of those promises. Because the promise result returns a promise itself, you can also use catch here. And you can also log here if there's an error. And this catch will handle both of those requests. So look how much easier it is to work with promises, because now to get a third person, all I need to do, as inside of the second person request, I need to return another promise to the next task, and just add another then, very similarly. So I'm just copying, and here, if you're returning null or you're returning nothing, it means that you're finished and no longer nothing is needed. So just remove this. and this will be the last request. So here, if I refresh the page, you're going to get 1, 2, 3 emails. And this is the basics of promise chaining. It's a very powerful tool to make a few requests one after another, which is a common use case for developing applications in JavaScript. You're going to have to call some API one time, get the result, call another one, maybe get another result, call another one. It happens. And this brings me to our second exercise. And this second exercise number 2. So, well, in the second exercise, I want you to add Axios and script.js to your workspace. Add Axios because you're going to use this. And the exercise itself is the following. Make HTTP call to get random user with Axios. And then, if random person, I always get confused. If the person is a male, make another request. Otherwise, do nothing. And also handle errors. Yeah, and handle errors. That's the one. So this one's a bit tricky because here now we're doing something complicated. I want to give you a small hint. So first you need to call the first user, and then after you have the first user details, you just need to inspect the gender. And if it's a male, then you need to call another request, and you need to do this with promise chaining. But if it's a female, just don't do anything. Don't make a second request. This is quite interesting logic. Try to do this. Have maybe 10 or 15 minutes to spend on this exercise. I will pause the video and I will show you the result, the solution shortly. All right, and we're back. So let me show the solution for this exercise right now. First of all, I'll just delete this code because I want to start from scratch. And I'm just going to keep the URL. So I'm going to first call Axios.get to call the API to get the first person. And to do this, you can just do then straight away on the Axios get. You don't need to have another constant, just like I did in the previous example, because Axios.get returns us a promise. So we can do just then and response. Here I'll just console log the response. Response.data. And how can we get the gender? I think I'll print the response.data to see how we're going to get the gender. Let's hop back onto the HTML page. I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to see that we need to go again to results, to 0. And the gender is just right here. So results in position 0, .gender. Let's do this. Results in position 0 and gender. Let's go back and check again. Cool. So now every time I refresh the page, I get different gender. Okay, let's store this into a constant. Gender, because this is what I want. Maybe person 1, gender. And this is the solution to the exercise. And this is the most important part, which might be a little bit tricky. So if person 1 gender is equals a male, then we need to make another request. Otherwise, done. How can we do this? So to use promise chaining, to make another request is to just call access once again. Access.get with random person API, and we need to return this. And this is the very important part. This is how chaining works. We're returning the next task to the next link of the chain. If the gender is female, then we don't need to do anything. So we'll just do anything. We'll just do nothing. And to use the promise chaining, we can now call then once again, and this then is the result of the first. This is the result. This then will go to the result of the first task. Or maybe I'll call it result now. And I will just console log result to show you what happens. I will also add the catch to handle errors and to print any error. Okay, once again, I'm using access.get, and then when we have the response, we'll inspect the data that comes from the backend. If the person is male, then we are returning another promise, and we're returning this to here. So this then will handle the result of the first then. And now I want to show you the example here in this code between getting male and getting female. So if you're getting email, we're making another call here, and once the second call returns, we're coming to the handle. So what happens if it's a female? If it's a female, we will immediately get to this then, because we're not returning anything. We'll immediately, you can also do like return, we can also maybe, this is even better. So this, if this person is a female, we can do return it was a female. Here we're returning a string, we're not returning a promise. And because we're returning a string, it will immediately go to the then. It will not wait. But you will still go to the second link of the promise. So let's investigate this. Let's try to refresh. First refresh, you got the data. Let's see, something is wrong. I think I should, oh yeah. I just want to, before that I want console log the gender, because I want to understand. Let's say result, first person one is a, and then we'll add the gender. I think this will be easier. So let's refresh. Okay, so look at this. This is a case when we got the female. So first we got the logged person one is a female, and the second log is it was a female. And if you see where this logs come from, this logs comes from the second then, because the return it was female got rolled over to the next then. It's still kind of another task. This time it's not asynchronous, so it invokes like immediately. But you still get the result here, you'll actually get the string. You'll actually get the string that was returned from here. So this result can be either it was a female or an object from Axios, which is the response of the second API call. It can be either of those. And let's try to refresh to get maybe a male to see the flow. Another female, another female, another female. And there we go. We got a male, and then instead of a string, we got the second person here. So we got the data of another person. This one is different from the first one because this is a second call. And maybe we can, instead of returning a string, maybe you can do something like return null. And then we can know if the result is null, then we know it was a female. So we can maybe console log it was a female, so we don't have any a second person. When I'm saying it, I'm talking about the gender, of course. And else, if the result is not null, then it must be this Axios result. So then we can easily use the result.data.results, just similar to this string, 0, and then we can print the email of the second person. Here, the result is the second person's response from the API. So this is why we can do this. Let's try again. And yes, the first one is an email, and then we got another. The first one is a male, and then we got an email. And if it's a female, then we don't have a second one. This exercise was a bit tricky, I know. This is a very important and powerful tool. How can you do it with promises? If it was with callbacks, it was very, very difficult to implement such logic, because then you have to nest more and more callbacks. In this case, you can also just return from this promise another promise and continue the chain as long as you want, or as long as you need, of course. And this is very important and very easy concept to understand about the promises, that you can chain those together. You can make complex ifs inside to process the data and decide if we should have another promise, or maybe we should be done. And this is very important to understand. If you're not understand this, I really encourage you to maybe pause the video to rewatch this part again, because we're going to build on top of that in the next section. So I just want to show you a last example with using the promises to see how easy it is to call a bunch of APIs one after another. So I'm just doing, once again, I'm deleting everything. I'm using axios.get. Then we have response for the first person. And after that, I want to return another person. So I'm doing like this. And the second time, I want to call to get third person. And then I want to call, so here I'm calling, so this is the result of the third person. And here finally I can maybe console log all done. And this, look how easy it is to call 3 APIs in a row, and compare this to the mess that we had here in XML HTTP requests. We had here about, I think, 30 lines of code to call 3 APIs and had errors. Here, well, we have 10 lines of code, including error handling. It can be like 15. And this is very easy. You can see here in the network tab, 1, 2, 3. 3 different responses. And you can do whatever you want with those in the then section. I hope that was clear about using promises, because now we're going to learn how can we create promises. In this section, we're not going to use, we're going to create. So let's go and create promises. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to keep this URL for now. So creating a promise. What I want to do in this exercise is I want to take this function, this fetch JSON function that uses XML HTTP request, and I want to convert it to use promises instead of a callbacks. All right. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to copy some sections from this function. So I'm going to copy the body itself, and I'm going to slowly create a function that does the same, only returns a promise. You usually use promises a lot more than creating ones, especially when you're developing in a client-side application. You will most of the time just use promises. But it's important to know that you can also create promises to do some tasks. So let's do this. I will call it fetch JSON promise. And because it's a promise, we don't need a callback anymore. So this function will only receive one URL as an input. And to create a promise, the syntax is the following. You should create a promise like this. You are defining a new property, a new constant, and you're using new promise. And this new promise has to take a function with two parameters. The first one is resolve, and the second one is reject. This is a function. So here inside we're handling the promise. After we're finished, we're doing something like this. We're doing return promise. So the way that this function works, it creates a promise and then immediately returns the promise. And when you call then on this function, then it will start executing the whole long task. So here, let's handle the promise. Now here we are inside this promise callback, and this promise callback has two functions. One is resolve and one is reject. And if you call resolve, it will change the status, the state of the promise to resolved, and call then. So as soon as you do resolve, it will call the then to the person who called it. And similarly, reject will change the status to rejected, and it will call the catch. Let me show you how it works in a real example. So I'm going to paste this whole mess of XHR. And now let's go line by line to see what kind of modifications we need to do to make this code work with XHR, with promise. So first we need to create new XML HTTP request. This is fine. We're now setting the JSON, which is also fine. Next is the onload. So when the XML HTTP request finished its work, we see that we're calling the callback, but we don't have the callback anymore. So what should we do instead? Instead, since this is a success here, we have the data in xhr.response, and we also have a successful status code, then what we need to do is just to call resolve with the data that I want to send back to the then callback response. So we're resolving the promise if it's successful. If it's an error, then we need to reject the promise with maybe the same error. It doesn't matter. You can pass here whatever you like, but it's always good to pass an error object. Same here, on error, you can also reject the promise, and you don't need to use the callback anymore. Reject. Right. And that's it. This is the exact change that you need to do to make this fetch JSON to work with promise. And let's give it a try, shall we? Now we don't need to use Axios because we have our own promise, which I think is very cool. First, I will take this function and I'll move this to the XHR section because I don't want to make it a little bit messy with my examples. So now we have in the XHR one with callback and one with promise. And I encourage you to pause the video, or maybe after this video, check those two functions and compare them. They look very similar. They both use XML HTTP requests, but one of them uses promises, and the other one uses just a simple callback. Let's give it a try. Fetch JSON promise with the URL that we already have. And then, just like before, response, console log, response. Let's also do catch, error, console log, error. Done. Let's give it a try. Yeah, and it works. So now we actually implemented our own little small HTTP client that uses promises instead of callbacks. And this is a simple way how to create a promise. So now we're going to our next exercise, exercise number 3. And in this exercise, you're going to create your own promise. And the exercise is to create a promise from the setTimeout function in JavaScript. So to be a little bit more clear, I want to use this JavaScript in the following way. Let's call the function maybe wait. And the input will be the number of milliseconds to wait. This is what you need to write. And how I will use it is the following way. I just want to use wait, maybe 1 second, and then I want to console log 1 second has passed. That's it. There is no error handling needed in this one. There is no error that might happen in setTimeout in JavaScript. So you need to implement this function, and you can use this little code to test if it works. So please do the exercise right now, and I'll show the solution in a few seconds. All right, I hope you managed to do this exercise. Let me show you the solution. So once again, we're going to create a function. We'll call it wait, and it will receive the millisecond amount of waiting. Since it's a promise, I need to return a promise. A little bit shorter syntax is to write return new promise. You'll see this a lot. Resolve, reject. This is instead of taking this promise, putting it into a constant, and then return a constant. I'm just returning this whole thing all together. So resolve and reject. And here we're going to call setTimeout function. This is built into JavaScript. And the setTimeout, as you recall, it takes 2 parameters. The first one is the callback, what to do after the time has passed. The second one is the amount of timeout. So the amount of timeout is milliseconds that we get as the input. And then what should we do when the time has passed? Well, since we want to call the then in the promise, then we should of course resolve the promise. And note, there is no reject, no call to reject. And why is there no call to reject? You can think about it for a second. And the reason is there's no call for reject because the setTimeout never fails. Because setTimeout never fails. So we will never have an error here. And that's it. This is the implementation of the function wait. I will copy the usage from my exercise file, and let's see if it works. I'm going back to the page, going to refresh. wait for 1 second, and yes, 1 second has passed. This was quite simple, and you can create promises from a complex task. Another example is you can create a promise that returns 2 emails from this API. So inside of your function, it will call them together. It will call them one after another, but it will return only one promise that combines all the emails. Here's an example. How can you do this? And the last example that I want to show you is I want to show you how can we do it all together. So what I'm going to do right now is call a random user API. Then I'm going to wait for 2 seconds, and then I'm going to call random user API again. I'm going to show the solution right now, but if you want, I really encourage you to pause the video, try to do this mini exercise, and then you can resume the video. Right, so let's do it. So I'm going to use Axios or fetch JSON promise. It doesn't matter. I think I'll just use the promise that we just wrote. And I'm going to give the URL to get the first person. Then response, and I'm going to maybe print console log the first response, and I'm going to wait for 1 second, and using this new cool wait function that we just wrote. So return wait for 2 seconds, and wait returns a promise, so we can use chaining to do this. And then here we don't really have any result. This will always be null because we're resolving here nothing. So there's no point for me to do something like here. I'm just waiting for then. And once it's done, I'm going to return another fetch JSON promise to call the second person. And then once I get the second person, I can console log all done. Let's add some console logs here. So the first one is, maybe I'll change it to got the first person, and then after that I will log waiting for 2 seconds. Oh, sorry, it should be here. I got the first person waiting for 2 seconds, and then here we finished waiting for 2 seconds. So finished waiting for 2 seconds, and we're getting the second person, and here got the second person. So once again, first I'm calling the fetch JSON promise function to get the first person from the API. After that, I'm waiting for 2 seconds by returning a promise. After the 2 seconds has passed, I'm returning another JSON promise, which will call to get the second person from the API. And after that, I'm printing the message here. Let's see how it works. I'm refreshing. There we go. And as you can see, it waited for 2 seconds, and then it got the second person. This was like a big, complete exercise of how can we use promises. And I think now we're going to learn a little bit about advanced usage of promises. We're going to learn 2 advanced topics. And I'm going to delete those because we're not going to need those anymore. And the first one I want to teach you is about promise.all function. Promise.all allows you to have a multiple promises at the same time, to call simultaneously a bunch of promises. And this is how it works. Just call promise, and note that we need the capital P here, promise.all, and then you pass an array of all the small promises. So what we can do is to create promise1. We can use Axios once again to do get a random person. We can use promise2. We can define 3 promises. So I've defined 3 promises here, and I want to call them not one after another, like we did in the previous examples. I want to call them all together at once. And then, only then, after I have all the 3 responses, only then I want to maybe show some message. Or maybe I want to combine the information to show the list of users. So the way to do this is to call promise.all and to pass an array of promises. This promise.all takes an array of promises, and what it does, it actually executes all promises, and the promise.all returns a promise itself. So we need to do something like this: all promises. It's actually a bad name. Combined promise. So promise.all returns a promise, and it will resolve the promise only after all of those 3 promises has been resolved. And if one of those is going to be rejected, then it will reject the big promise, the combined promise. So then inside this will be array of results, because it will give you the results for 1, for 2, and for 3. And here console.log all promises completed, and I can also console log the array of results. And we can use catch error, and I will log that console log that some of the promises rejected. Okay, so promise.all is a very powerful tool to call multiple promises at the same time, wait for all the responses. Again, promise.all will wait for all those 3 will resolve. So if one of those will take, I don't know, 10 seconds and will be a bit slow, it will wait for everything to get resolved. Let's see it in live. When I refresh the page, there you go. I see all promises completed, and I see 1, 2, and 3. What I do want to show you is the network tab. When I go to the network tab, as you can see, those APIs has been launched together at the same time. It looks like it's not, but they should be styled. Yeah, there might be some restrictions from the library or something, but they are launching at the same time. And this is quite a really important tool, which I also want to show you the example between the previous one that we got one after another, and to use promise.all. This is something called difference between serial and parallel. So in the example above, this is a serial execution. And serial execution, this is what we did earlier. We first called the first task. After the first task completed, then we're calling to the second task. And after the second task completed, then we're calling to the third task. And after that, it's finishing. In the parallel section, this is quite different. It's called those 3 tasks at the same time, waits for the longest to complete, and then goes to finish. So this is quite a difference, and there are advantages and disadvantages to use either of those. You can maybe think about any reasons to use parallel, maybe for speed or serial. Maybe sometimes you do need to know the response of task 2 in order to continue. And you can combine them together. And this leads us to our final exercise for this section, for this video. And the final exercise, exercise number 4, is going to combine maybe everything that we learned in the last hour. So I want you to call random user API twice in parallel. Parallel, I mean promise.all, yes. And then I want you to inspect the results. If both users are females, if both users are females, then make another 2 API requests in serial, and if either one, otherwise do nothing. So this one's a bit tricky. You need to really combine everything that we learned. You need to do chaining, you need to call promise.all, and then and you need to call the API. You can feel free to use Axios or fetch JSON, it doesn't matter. So yeah, you can pause the video now and take maybe 10-15 minutes to think about the solution. This one is a quite difficult exercise. Try to do your best, and I'll share the solution in a bit. All right, so let me show you the solution for this exercise. I really hope that you managed to do this. If not, follow along and let me show you the solution. Okay, so I'm going to use this example here. No, actually, so I'm going to start fresh. I'm going to use, let's use the fetch JSON promise that I made. So we need to make 2 requests in parallel. This is the first section. Make 2 requests in parallel. Maybe I'll pin the exercise down here so we can all see. So call the random user API twice in parallel. How can we do this? Well, we learned promise.all. So we can do something like this. Person1 promise and person2 promise. So we have 2 promises here. They're still not ready. We need to wait for them. And we can do promise.all with those 2 promises. Person1 promise and person2 promise. And because it's a promise, I can use then result. And here we have the result of the 2 promises. Now let's inspect those. Promise.all returns an array, and every array matches to the result, to the response in this array. So we're going to have array of 2 items, of 2 results. I think it's better to maybe console log it to see the best. I encourage you to console log everything just to make sure. And let's go and see what happens. So we got array of 2 items, and let's see what we have here. So item number 0 and item number 1. And those 2, they have the results. And the results, they have 0 once again, because this is the API that we already know, and the male, the gender here. So we need to call the array. We need to call the first one to get then results, and then gender to get the gender of the first one. And we need to do similarly the gender of the second one. So let's do this. Console const gender1. It will be result 0 dot I'm going back again because I totally forgot. Dot results. The name is quite confusing, so I'm going to change it from result to result array, or maybe responses. I think responses is good because it does some responses for the two promises. So responses, the first response, and then results, and then gender. And the second one, gender 2, will be responses in position 1 because we need to do the second response. Dot gender. So once again, the response 0, I want to recap. Responses 0 is the response of person promise 1. And the responses 1 in index 1 is the result of person 2 promise. Because we passed an array in promise all, we're also going to get an array as response, and they have to match. Now let's log those, just to make sure that we are doing everything together and everything correctly. We should now see the response to genders. And result is not defined, yes, because I've changed this. I actually don't need this anymore. And property 0 is undefined. I think let's go back and print the responses just to make sure, because sometimes you do mistakes. So let's do a quick check. So results 0. So we got an array, and we need to get the index 0, and we need to get the results and the first result. So responses is an array, so I'm going to the first response. Oh yeah, this is the problem. It should be results because it's results here. This results comes from the API. Let's test this again. Okay, we got two females. Once again, we got two females, male and female. Cool, so it works. Now let's do this logic. So now that we call the second one, let's check if both are female, then we should do something. So I'm doing an if statement. If gender 1 equals female and gender 2 equals female, then what I need to do is to actually do two new requests, but this time I want to do those in serial. So how can I do this? Well, I do need to make another request, so it kind of makes sense to do return and to have another third request to get ready. And this is for the promise all section. And now this one is a bit tricky. I really hope that you're still catching up. Now the then, because I'm returning here, it will come to then with the result of person 3, right? So this is the result of person 3. And no, don't forget that if both are not female, then we're still going to get to the then, but it will be just empty because we didn't return anything. So we should definitely check person 3 result. If we have a person 3 result, which means we got the response for the third person, and we need to do another request to get the fourth person. Otherwise, here we didn't get two females, so there was no new third response. So we just don't do anything. Maybe I will just console log done. And lastly, once again, I'm doing then person, and then we're going to do person 4 results. And here we already got the 4th person. I think let's log a little bit to show you what we have so far. So agenda 2. And here maybe we can console log 3rd person response. And here we can console log the 4th person response. Of course, we need to check if we actually got into this flow or not. So let's try this out. All right, so I refreshed and I got male and a female. So I got only 2 requests. And I can see the 2 requests here, and that's good. And I'm done. Let's refresh until we got 2 females. Male and female. There we go. Here we got 2 females, and as you can see, we also got the 3rd and the 1st person in the serial. So let's look at the requests. You see that those first two, those are the 2 first persons. The gender was female, and after that we made another additional 2 requests to get the 3rd and the 1st person information. This example is complicated, but I think it's a really good example of the power of the strength of the promises. How can we use promises to do like really complex solutions to really complex problems? They are really powerful, and you can do a lot of things asynchronously with promises. And next week you'll also learn about async await, which is even easier way how can we work with asynchronous programming in JavaScript. One last thing that I wanted to say a word about is about another small function. We have the promise all. We also have promise race. I will not show an example. So promise race will resolve the promise if any of the promises, not if any, no, sorry. So the promise all will resolve itself, will resolve after all promises are resolved. So the promise all will wait for all promises. Will wait for all. The promise race will wait only for the first one. So the promise race also takes an array, takes a lot of promises, and the first promise that returns a success, it will take its response, and that's it. It will ignore the others. It's sometimes useful, maybe if you have like 3 different API points and you want to see which one gives you the data the fastest. So you have one server in New York, one server in Tokyo, and one server in London, and you want to send the request to those 3 servers, and those 3 servers which send you the same data, but you will take only the fastest one. Sometimes it's rare cases that you will see promise race. I just want to mention it. So this concludes the promises. It was a bit heavy. I just want to show you this table as a summary of how to use and create promises. So in this row, you can see, in this column, you can see the usage, and the second column, you see how can we create. So to recap, if you want to use promises, Then we need to call the then method to get the success, and the catch method to get the error handling. To create if we are creating a promise, then we need to call the resolve function to resolve the promise, and this will call the then to the user who is using the promise, and to call the reject if we want to, if there's an error and we want to reject the promise, and the user will go to the catch. This nice table is just a quick summary about what we learned. So what we learned today, we learned that callbacks are very simple and they're easy to use for simple cases, but they're very complex and they don't provide a good solution for async programming when we try to do really complex things. And we learned about that promises just making life a lot of easier. Promises are hard to understand, but they are making the async programming much more easier, maintainable, and just better. And we learned that we can chain a lot of promises together. You can have one promise that calls another, that calls another, that calls another. And we also learned how can we create our own promises. And we also see how can we combine promises for both parallel and serial flows. And this was the last example, which was a little bit more complicated. I really hope that you learned everything that you need about promises. It's really important. I think this is maybe the most important topic in JavaScript 3. And this really shows the power of async programming in JavaScript. And also, promises are not unique for JavaScript. You will see promises in many other programming languages. There are some, if you already use Python, for example, Python has promises as well. It's a really common pattern, and it's really important for you to get familiar with, because a lot of APIs, a lot of libraries use promises. We also learned about Fetch API, which also use promises. So, so my goal here and my what I really want is for you to get really, really comfortable working with promises. And you don't really have to get like this whole complex example, the last example, this parallel serial, but the chaining is the most important part that you should take from this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I wish you all have a great day.